Behind me is Jamestown, Virginia, the site of the first permanent uh, English colony in North America. There had been a previous attempt to colonize North America in the form of a colony in North Carolina that was implanted in the 1580s, and then a few years later, people returned to it to see what was going on there. Returned from England and discovered that the colonists had vanished, and we've never determined definitively what happened to the colonists, whether they were killed, whether they died of disease or went someplace else, so on. There've been a lot of theories, but nobody knows for sure. Um, Considerable amount of time went by before the attempt that resulted in the creation of the Jamestown settlement, and that's what we'll be talking about today: is the creation of the Jamestown settlement, and before that, discussion about English colonization in general. That, and before that, this discussion of the general problem of governance in human society, which is something that it goes on every day in our society, and we don't think about the dense web of agreements um, via law, criminal law, civil law, contract law, and so on, that binds society together, as well as a shared understanding of customs and norms and this kind of a thing. People sometimes disagree about, what the customs and norms and so forth should be, but these things exist, but they didn't always exist, and they have existed in different forms. And this question of governance really arises very early in the story of any kind of colonization, but particularly English colonization. I'm going to share the screen with you. Okay. Here are the terms for the lecture, and by way of reminder, these terms are what you would want to focus on, because these are the ones that are most likely to appear in one form or another on quizzes and examinations. I want to start at an unlikely starting point. The AMC television series The Walking Dead, which was sort of wildly popular, ran for 11 seasons and has sort of spun off a franchise of other Walking Dead um, TV series, some of them limited series, some of them sort of more open ended, video games and whatnot. What makes The Walking Dead interesting is its focus on what do people do, when civilization as they've known it is just completely stripped away. When you have this phenomenon of what amount to zombies, nobody ever calls them zombies. They call them walkers, skin eaters, lame brains, and stuff like that, biters. But everybody who dies now, everybody who dies, not just those who are bitten by zombies, but everyone who dies turns into a zombie. And so essentially, um, everyone who was alive on the planet uh, has turned into a zombie in the initial stages when people didn't understand what was going on. And now there's the constant problem of when a person dies, they turn into a zombie unless something is done about it. And the one thing you can do is to get them in the brain. That's the only thing that kills them off. Okay. There are different ways that zombie movies can approach, the problem of what happens when you have a zombie apocalypse. Some of them go for kind of let's look at this through the lens of a pandemic. But again, The Walking Dead looks at it from the standpoint of the challenge of creating society that can survive in this new environment. And the first societies that form aren't really societies in any term that we would think about. They are kind of clots of people who are thrown together either because they are family or because they're friends, and but often because you have a melding of friends and then individuals or other families, sorry, of melding of families and then other people, some of whom are friends, some of whom are strangers, who combine by accident or design, and you create what amount to bands of varying sizes. The central band, as it were, that gets followed for all 11 seasons is one that is created around a deputy sheriff in Georgia. His name is Rick Grimes. He's in the center there. And by the way, this is a very idealized picture of what goes on, because the series itself is very gritty and gory and violent, and just to a point that is really quite striking. But anyway, in the early stages, you have this small band, and they go from place to place, figuring out how to survive. And in the early stages, they'll reach a crisis point, and then there'll be like discussion. I mean, not like sit down, let's talk about this and reason our way to the next thing, but I mean like a very quick discussion about, okay, here's what's happened, and here's what we need to do about it. And Rick Grimes is a kind of a natural leader, and most of the time people do sort of look to him and follow his lead, but every now and again they question this. It's like, well, why should Rick have the say in this, and why not go in this different direction? And sometimes most of the group will accept something and one individual won't, um, and so on. Well, there reaches a crisis point early in the series where the question of what to do next is a crucial one. And there have been events that have transpired that have cast a kind of a question mark over whether Rick is the person who should lead the the party. And it's not as though Rick Grimes wants to be the leader. It's just that when these decisions have to be made, people tend to follow, Rick's appraisal of the situation, assessment, and what to do about it. There, we go. Oh, well, before I go on, there is actually an optional but recommended video segment that I would like you to read. Would like you to watch. I would make it required, except that only the first 3 minutes, 18 seconds or so are relevant to the course. And soon thereafter, the video goes on to look at certain scenes of encounters between uh, the humans and the zombies or walkers or whatever you want to call them. And that part is not only irrelevant, it's pretty gross, gory, violent, and things that might be disturbing, for some students, and therefore the video, which follows this presentation, is optional but recommended. And I recommend watching it, but just to the 3 minute 18-second mark or thereabouts, and I recommend against watching it any farther. But this raises the question of, since humanity has sort of been has gone back to square one and is now in something approximating humanity in a sort of state of nature, this raises the question of a sort of famous thought experiments conducted by two political philosophers, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Now, both were thinkers during the colonial period. Both were English, and both had sort of a major impact on political thought during the time. Hobbes was the earliest to be working, and then Locke followed along shortly thereafter. But I'm going to take the two in reverse order. Both of them when thinking about humanity in a state of nature, we're doing it as a point of departure from which to discuss, what society should look like, and also, and this is crucial, the relationship between um, the the government and the governed, and particularly between uh, the monarch, which is the dominant form of governance during this period, and the monarch's subjects. Now, Locke, his point of departure is okay, in a state of nature, um, people, everybody sort of just kind of like, gets along. They don't need to interact very much. There's plenty of resources for everyone, small population, and people can kind of do their own thing, and it isn't a problem. But they kind of think, well, it would be nice to to construct like barns, let's say, for housing grain, and why don't we cooperate to create that? And then it'd be nice to think in terms of something that it would help us to get together and create some kind of defensive establishment, in case there's any kind of people who become predatory. So we'll do that. And then down the line, it'd be nice to create um, churches or temples or whatever for places where people could practice some kind of religious observance, and so on. So so basically, people agree to create a civilization together. Now, it's understood that in order to create this civilization, there has to be leadership. And Locke presumes that there'll be effectively a single leader. And so the way that he looks at it is individuals voluntarily give up their own self-governance, as it were, to the leader, but this giving this power is provisional, um, and and the terms really is that the monarch must conduct themselves in a way that benefits the subjects. They can't be a tyrant. They can't try to subjugate their subjects and boss them around, and so on. And if they do, then they break what Locke calls the social contract. And these subjects have the right to withdraw their power from the tyrant and reorganize, overthrow the tyrant, and create new governance. Pick a different monarch or a different form of government, and so on. That's John Locke. And by the way, Locke's ideas are extremely influential, and I think extremely is not too strong a way of putting it. Influential on the founders, and Locke's ideas are all but plagiarized in the beginning, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Hobbes's idea about humans in a state of nature is very different. And there's a famous passage in a book that he wrote called Leviathan, published in 1660. And this is what he has to say about humans in a state of nature. And it really it applies to the zombie apocalypse, The Walking Dead, in very, very strongly. Uh, and but it also applies to the colonists when they first come ashore and have to figure out their situation, because there is the problem of disease, there's the problem of the indigenous people and how to relate to them, there is the problem of how are we going to construct cabins, and what are we going to do in the event of famine, and how are we going to start farming or conducting the business that brought us to North America in the first place. And so these things occur in a context that is very close to Hobbes's idea of what humanity is like in a state of nature. This is this famous passage from Leviathan. I'm just going to read it to you. Whatsoever there is consequent to a time of war. So he's likening this to a time of war. Every man is enemy to every man. The same consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. This is obviously written in the 1660s, but so the language is a little, you know, 1660-ish. But to go on, in such condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. So, don't build a barn or don't start manufacturing anything or whatever because it could be taken away from you in an instant. Consequently, no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no extensive building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force beyond what an individual human can exert. No knowledge of the face of the earth because it's dangerous to travel anywhere. No account of time because you don't have any way to keep track of time. No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, and this is the phrase that some people sort of know almost by heart, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that very definitely applies to um, what's going on when you have the zombie apocalypse in The Walking Dead. And it is an overcoming this situation is a recurrent theme throughout all 11 seasons of The Walking Dead. And what goes on with The Walking Dead is that you have this tendency of people to come together, and then there is some kind of crisis. Sometimes the situations where they're just get overrun by zombies, and sometimes it's situations where outside groups try to attack because there is a real scarcity of resources, scarcity of food, scarcity of gasoline, scarcity of other things that people need, for life. And there are people who basically think that it's sort of every person or every group for itself. So the problem of how do we organize ourselves, or even should we try to organize ourselves, and how are we going to do it, recurs throughout the series. And without giving too much of it away, because I think if you haven't watched The Walking Dead, you really should. It's pretty cool. Um, the solution nearly always involves a single leader, because, put it this way, democracy is process oriented. What we want to do is get together and we have a clear understanding of how we as individuals vote for representatives who obviously represent us in a government setting. Uh, these legislators, these representatives, meet, make laws. We have an executive in our society who signs off on these laws and changes them from bills to actual laws that are enforced. This occurs at the local level with mayors, occurs at the state level with governors, occurs at the national level, obviously, with the president. So this is a process. And as long as this process works, as long as it results in the outcomes that are desired, then people are okay with democracy. But at the end of the day, I would say that people are more outcome oriented than process oriented. And so if the democratic process fails to result in what they think that they need and what is right and so on, then they're going to go from a process oriented thing like democracy to something that we would think of as being authoritarian. Now, before I move on, there's a term that I would like you to learn called legitimacy, and I'm going to stop sharing because we really don't need this Hobbes quote anymore. It's about legitimacy, legitimate authority. Let's say that that I have a house on a street that is not terribly busy. But let's say that I had a house that was on a street that was busy, and people were always speeding through it, or often speeding through it. I could try to stop them. Uh, I might, impede their progress. I might be able to stop them in some kind of other way. I might insist that they obey the speed limit. But my authority to do this um, is would not be perceived as being legitimate because it's like, well, who who made you, which of us gave you this kind of authority to do this? I didn't agree to it. I don't know if anybody else who agreed to it. So the only way that I could enforce this, I might, like scream at them and they really scream back, "Hey, old man, set your pie hole," and then go on and do their thing. Uh, but it's unlikely that they would say, "Yeah, you're right. I should be slowing down. There's children around. There's little puppies and so forth that I might, squash." Um, that's not the usual reaction. On the other hand, if a patrol car were there and a policeman were to stop the person who was speeding and go to them and give them a ticket, basically, "Hey, you're going to get fined. You're going to pay money, because you were speeding." The person would not say, "Well, you know, I feel like I can speed if I want to, and who are you to tell me that I can't?" Um, and at the end of the day, they might be doing it out of just fear. If I don't obey this policeman, he would shoot me. He's got a gun. He might use it. But it never comes to that. Why? Because the policeman's authority is considered to be legitimate. That we have agreed that our government has authority over it. We agree that the government is supposed to have authority over it. Therefore, we agree that the police, constituted by the government, have authority over us. And this legitimacy is very important to governance because otherwise you can govern only through fear. You're going to do this because otherwise I'm going to kill your family, or I'm going to, put you in jail for a long time, or I'm going to do other dire things to you. And yeah, that's a way to make people obey you, but it's based entirely on fear. And so what you have to do is to keep people in a constant state of fear, or the system doesn't work. It is so much easier to get people to buy in to the system and obey voluntarily. And the way to do that is to make governance, give it a sense of legitimacy, legitimate government, so that um, in the early modern world and previously as well, since was that, well, we have a monarch, and the monarch has legitimate authority over us, and so that's why we're going to obey. Now, in the 17th century, in 17th century England, the question of whether the monarch had legitimate authority over the subjects was very much in question, to the point that there was a long and bloody civil war in England in the 1640s that resulted in the overthrow of the monarch Charles I and his beheading by axe, and then the imposition really of rule by one man, a military dictator named Oliver Cromwell. People didn't like that very well, and so a few years later, in 1660 or so, the English decided, let's get, Cromwell's died. Let's not go down this road again. Let's get a hold of Charles I's son, who was on the lam and went to France to survive. Let's have Charles' son come back and become King Charles II, um, and go back to the monarchical system, because we discovered that it works. And so Charles II is a monarch who's given legitimate authority, and Charles II manages to rule effectively. Um, he dies. His brother, James II, takes the throne. There are problems with James II. He gets overthrown and replaced by a dual couple, William and Mary. So all through the 17th century, the English are wrestling with this question of legitimate authority. And in the colonial context, the question is one of legitimate authority, but also one of effectiveness. So the government has to be considered to be legitimate, but it also has to be effective. And if it isn't effective, that actually compromises its legitimate authority. Hey, look, we expect you to get things done. We expect you to produce outcomes that we can live with. You're not doing it. And so, that compromises your legitimacy. And we're going to do something about it. We're going to rebel. We're going to complain to the king. We're going to do something to create a situation that works for us. And in the early stages of English colonization, unlike colonization in the Spanish colonies or in the Portuguese colonies, the monarch, the English monarch, had neither the desire nor the ability, the span of control to to govern the colonists directly. The Spanish monarchy had the span of control and the authority to govern the Spanish colonies directly. The same thing was true for the Portuguese monarch. This was not true for the English colonists. The early English colonies were pretty much on their own once they landed in North America, and and so they had, for all practical purposes, to come up with their own systems of government. And usually these are relied upon. Okay, we have a consensus that, say, William Bradford, when it comes to the Pilgrims, is going to be our leader. But even William Bradford, could not just sort of rule by decree. I think we should do this, therefore it's going to do it. There has to be a sort of a degree of consensus that goes on. Well, that pretty much works well. And then when the Puritans arrive in the 1630s and 1640s, you can read about this in the American Yawp. They too have a leader, John Winthrop, but he also rules by consensus. And there are other people within the Massachusetts Bay Colony who have a formal or informal role in assisting in the governance of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But both the Pilgrims and the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony are actually able quite early on to create governments, self-governance, that is both legitimate and effective. This does not happen in Jamestown, notwithstanding the fact that Jamestown manages to survive to be the first permanent colony in North America. It was really a near-run thing, and it was entirely possible that this colony, Jamestown colony, might well have been wiped out. So let's look at Jamestown closely. Okay. Let's begin before we get to Jamestown per se. Let's look at the varieties of colonization, just to give you an overview of what English colonization looked like. The period of colonization comprises really more than a century and a half of the history of what would become the United States. So 169 years, from 1607 to 1776, the English colonies were colonies, and only at that point did they become independent and become and set up the United States. And by the way, it should be borne in mind that at this time, other countries were also colonizing areas that would eventually become part of the United States. The Spanish were in Florida and also in the American Southwest. The Dutch founded New York, which was originally New Amsterdam, and there are soon two main paradigms when it comes to English colonization. The first is that of Virginia, which has as its nucleus Jamestown. It exemplified a colony established to make a profit. So there was an economic motive to cross the Atlantic Ocean and establish this colony. And then the other one is Massachusetts Bay. where the Puritans created their society alongside the Pilgrims. And the Massachusetts Bay exemplified a colony that was established to create a new form of society, specifically um, a form of society that followed a specific kind of religion. In this case, what was called the Puritan form of the English the English church, the establishment, and we'll get to that down the line. But if you look at every colony, the eventual 13 colonies, pretty much without exception, they were founded either um, but by an economic motive or by a religious motive. So, now, the characteristics of English colonization are these. First, you have a leadership group that is drawn from gentry sons who are seeking a genteel life. Now, what does it mean to be a member of the gentry? This means to be someone who has property or comes from a family that has property, that has grown up in an environment that if it's not wealthy, it's certainly they have more resources and more to work with and better housing and so on than just ordinary people, laborers, farmers, and so on. And they're seeking, and these gentry sons are nearly always the younger sons in a family because the oldest son is the one who inherits the property of the father, and the younger sons kind of get cut out of this by law. So they're kind of like, well, I'd like to have a guaranteed genteel life, and right now I'm dependent upon the goodwill of my older brother, and I'd like to be more independent. And so um, the leadership group either comes from these sons who are there to, I'm going to go across the North Atlantic and I want to acquire property and I want to acquire wealth, and that's what um, makes me interested in colonization. Or, I'm William Bradford and I happen to come from the gentry, and so I come from um, the class that is the normal ruling class. People just, by custom, look to members of the gentry for leadership, and that's how I became a leader. We're all Christians. We're all concerned with worshiping in a certain kind of way, but leadership comes naturally to me. People look to me. I'm the Rick Grimes in this situation, and so you have that leadership group. You also have a mass of unemployed who are willing to immigrate. Overpopulation isn't the problem, but rather economic dislocation. A lot of people are out of work. And so they immigrate with an E means leaving a country. Immigrate with an I means to come, those who come into a country. So you have a lot of people who want to leave the country, and they become colonists. Um, and again, it's not so much that there's overpopulation in Europe, but rather there's a problem of economic dislocation. Many people are out of work. There's a substantial amount of private capital, money basically, available to underwrite the cost of getting the ships and the supplies and so on to carry to create the colony. And so there are investors who get together and basically say, okay, what's going to happen is we're going to underwrite the cost of sending these people, across to North America. They are going to establish themselves. They're going to begin to generate wealth in some kind of way, and we're going to get a cut of the wealth that gets generated. So that's the model. And where's the monarchy in all of this? Well, it isn't really. These companies go to the monarch and they say, hey, we want to do this. We know that these areas of North America belong to England, belong to you, and so we would like your legal permission to establish a colony. And the monarchy is like, yeah, okay, fine, you can do that, and I sign off on this. But I'm not really very interested in this thing. I didn't start this, you did, and I'm not going to sustain this colony. You're going to, and so on. So those are the characteristics of English colonization in the early stages. Now, there's an ideology of colonization that is involved here with the Spanish and the Portuguese, particularly the Spanish. Their model of colonization derives from the reconquest of Spain, which for centuries had been under the control of Muslims who had sort of just, there was this sort of explosive of growth of Islam, quite quickly, and a very rapid expansion that goes across North America and then crosses the Mediterranean Sea and gets into Spain, and indeed briefly gets pretty far into France. But in areas that when the Spanish reconquer Spain, or conquer it for the first time, depending on how you want to look at it, the pattern is assimilation. Hey, you're Muslim, you know, how would you like to convert to Christianity? How would you like to convert to Catholicism? And if they do, and lots of them did, then you had a process of assimilation between the two. And this idea of assimilation carries over to the creation of the Spanish colonies. And what tends to happen is that the Spanish, from Europe, intermarry with the indigenous population, and you create a society that is largely composed of what are called mestizo in Mexico and other areas. And so assimilation is the policy. In the case of England, the policy or the ideology derives from the English conquest of Ireland, which is sort of England's first and closest and arguably most troublesome colony. Now, both the English and the Irish are Christian, but the English look upon the Irish as, well, they're Catholics, and we're mostly Protestant after a while. We don't really think they're Catholics in any real sense. We think that their Catholicism is a thin veneer for their pagan heritage. They have customs that seem that are alien. Their form of society seems to be inferior, and so when the English come across, there are two things that happen. The first is they are extraordinarily violent when it comes to colonizing Ireland, and what you have here is essentially a military conquest. And the native Irish are not absorbed. They don't have an assimilation. What you have instead is the English arrive and they push the Irish beyond what is called the Pale of Settlement. So that's the ideology of colonization. That's what happens when that gets transferred. The way that the English operate is on the assumption that, okay, we're going to land here, and the indigenous peoples are going to have to just go someplace else. And they too, tend to get pushed beyond this Pale of Settlement. And this is done usually through warfare. There's a kind of a limited interaction, or a limited Christianization of Native Americans. And in Massachusetts Bay, you have the creation of what are called praying villages. But mostly it is, hey, we're European, they're indigenous, or they would call them, they're Indians, and we're not going to intermarry. We're not going to assimilate. That's just not how this thing is going to work. Now, the pattern of colonization is this. You have utopian plans, ideal plans. So in the case of Jamestown, it's like we're going to cross the Atlantic, we're going to establish a colony, And then, just like the Spanish, who found gold and other forms of wealth in Mexico and Peru and other places, we're going to find that kind of wealth in North America. Surely there's gold uh, in North America too. Surely there are other forms of wealth that we will find rapidly. And what we're going to do is we are going to get rich quick. In the case of Massachusetts Bay, the Puritans come over and they say, well, there's this very imperfect English society, and here's what we like about it, but here's what we mostly don't. And what we're going to do is to create an ideal society, a perfect society as we understand it, a perfected version of the European society from which we come. Then what happens is reality frustrates those plans. And we'll talk about how reality frustrates the plans in Jamestown in this lecture presentation, and look at how it frustrates the plans of the Puritans in a subsequent one. So it's kind of like, shoot, the situation here is so much different from what we expected, or the situation is just exactly what we expected, but our ability to gain control uh, over uh, the what we find here is different from what we thought it was going to be. So reality frustrates these initial plans. And you have an adjustment by the survivors, the creation of a new form of society, and gradually um, a change often in what the colony is mainly there for. So in the case of Massachusetts Bay, you go from a religious motive over time to a colony that is basically interested in creating economic wealth. But so utopian plans, reality intrudes, and then an adjustment by the survivors, resulting in a new form of society. Okay, so here is the location of the Jamestown colony. We're sort of at last where we can discuss this. It was there had been that one previous attempt at colonization, the lost colony that you see in the lower right-hand corner. The Jamestown colony was set up by a company of investors called the Virginia Company, which was based in England, and the investors stayed in England. Uh, and the investors, gave the colonists or the prospective colonists a charter, and they said, okay, here's the rules between us, and here are your instructions for when you arrive in North America. Here's how you're going to be governed. Here's what you're going to do, and much of the instructions are actually um, military in nature. Here's how you're going to establish your security. And the first thing they said is, hey, look, right now we're not at war with the Spanish, but we very often are. The Spanish have a big fleet. It's bigger than anything England can wield. And so, and the first thing you might learn about the new war between Spain and England is a Spanish fleet coming up and capturing you. You didn't know anything, even know that you were in danger. So what we want you to do is establish a colony that is in a way that is secluded, that the Spanish can't find very easily. And so when the English colonists, come to Virginia, they look for a place that is secluded, and they find this broad estuary, and they call that's part of a river, and they call the river the James River after James the First, the king, and then they establish Jamestown, also named for the king. But they do it about 60 miles upstream from the mouth of the James River, and they put it in, and it's that far up because the Spanish are unlikely to find the colony, and then they create the fort. One of the first things that they do is that they apply for their own security, and this is what their fortified encampment looks like. It's got a few cannon and so on. You can see that the number of people is really pretty limited. And then here is a reconstruction of the Jamestown fortification from the interior. Now, so far, so good, except that number one, here's Jamestown Island. And yeah, it's really secure, not just from the Spanish, but also from the indigenous people. Um, so they can protect themselves, from what we now think of as being the indigenous people, what were back then were called, just called, the Indians. Um, so, so yeah, it's secure, but it's a very swampy area. So you have stagnant water. And stagnant water is where, mosquitoes can breed in large numbers, and stagnant water is water that is really dicey to try and drink. And so this area was made to order for disease. And so quite early on, the Jamestown colonists discovered that they were struck by disease. The second thing that happened that they didn't like was that, hey, where's all this wealth that we want? So we can't find any. So that's kind of frustrating. Well, and also, how are we going to like feed ourselves? And so we didn't think very much about it. Were you a farmer back in England? No. Did you want to be a farmer here? No. This is, to the extent that I have any acquaintance with agriculture, I wanted to get away from it, become wealthy. So they don't really know how to farm. They're not motivated to farm. And so the colony struggles in that kind of way, sort of shoot themselves in the foot. The third thing is what the English had discovered in the early attempts to colonize were the same things that the Spanish had discovered in Mexico, which is to say, you have these indigenous tribes or peoples, and they don't like each other. There are rivalries and there are wars between these different tribes. And what they, is what we can do is we can sort of support this tribe and get their support for us, their acceptance of us, because we can give them weapons and and goods that they can use to take out the other tribe or to defend themselves or attack and so forth. And when these guys become problematic, it's like, well, we'll deal with these guys instead. So they can play these tribes off against one another. That can't be done um, in Jamestown because this whole area is part of what's called the Powhatan Confederation. Yes, there are different tribes, but they are all under the control of um, an indigenous chief whose name was Powhatan. So, so that's bad. You have disease. You have you have difficulty finding any wealth at all. In fact, it just doesn't happen. And then you have, you sort of, your colony exists at the sufferance of Powhatan. And at first, Powhatan is kind of like, well, you're around, but you're not really a threat. And I might be able to get some good out of you. And you don't bother me. I'm not going to bother you. And early on, this you're not going to bother me, I'm not going to bother you thing, breaks down. And so does the ability of the Jamestown settlers to feed themselves and function the way that they need to. And in 1608, John Smith, this soldier of fortune, he fought in various wars in Europe, and he was pretty much the only guy who was a military professional, really understood about the arts of war and so forth. He takes control of the colony. So whatever process they had before that, it's all out the window. And what they have now is a dictator in the form of John Smith, and he takes control, and he basically says, you know, work or else. And so everybody who's been kind of like, well, I don't really want to farm and so forth, they now go to work because they don't want to deal with or else. Then in 1610, I'm going to go to the next one. This is a reconstruction of Jamestown. In 1610, things really go south for the Jamestown colony. Um, it's a very cold winter, and food is very scarce. And so, many died from the cold, and they died because they didn't get enough nutrition. And this was a really bad problem to the point where some people resorted to cannibalism. They ate, one another. That's what cannibalism is all about. I'm going to stop sharing at this point, And I'm going to give you kind of a chance to catch your breath because it's been kind of, kind of long, and then I'll pick up in part two of this lecture.